Hey everyone, my name's Dylan. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I'd like to do these videos as often as I can spare the time and on a variety of topics. Today I want to talk about the philosopher Foucault and his ideas about power, and some of how it relates to the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, and the idea of nonviolence. Part 1. Normalising Power. When we think about power, we almost invariably think about a king or a ruler as its symbol, and violent action as tools of oppression. Certainly when we think of the civil rights movement, images of riots, beatings, arrests are what come directly to mind. But the power at play isn't just displayed through the language of violence. As French historian and philosopher Michel Foucault saw it, power is everywhere. It comes from everything. Moreover, power is not just repressive or physical, it's also normalizing or pervasive. This theory is instrumental in our current understanding of power. According to Foucault, normalizing power is tied to our knowledge of the world and how it works. It allows certain types of knowledge to have influence, which we then recognize as power. This is also why Foucault says that science has an intrinsic connection to power, because it changes our understanding. Foucault says that this power makes a person turn him or herself into a subject, and no one is immune from this kind of power. Just as a poor, black minimum wage earner learns from bodies with normalizing power how they should act, a wealthy, white politician learns from the same bodies how they should act. The normalizing power at work here is what determines the beliefs and desires of those individuals. Take stealing, for example. We very rarely think of actually stealing, and even when we do, we never really seriously consider it. Normalizing power makes us want to do what we have to do. So it's making us willingly do what society says is required. Most people don't avoid stealing because of the repressive power of law and order, i.e. the threat of going to jail. Instead, they do it because of the belief systems that are in place, which have been normalized. Obviously, there are exceptions, but those are symptomatic of normalizing power itself. They define themselves by the presence of the norm. The allowed deviation from the norm is also established by normalizing power. You might pick up and keep, say, a pen that someone dropped, but you probably wouldn't keep a wallet or a smartphone. Foucault also stresses that in his model of power, it's not just a destructive or repressive force, it's actually creative. It creates our society and ideals, how to be a good citizen, and it teaches us our values and belief systems. Foucault's main point throughout all of this is that the main form of power is not what we have traditionally thought of as power. Right and wrong, beliefs about purpose, social well-being, all of these are aspects of normalizing power that everyone is subject to, and they don't have to have the appearance of symbols of power that we have traditionally thought of them as in order to have the same effect. Part 2. Repressive Power. Repressive power, on the other hand, is the classical definition of power, which pressures us to do things we may not necessarily want to do. When we willfully disobey the conventions that we know are expected of us, repressive power steps in to force us to do what society says is required. It's for this reason that repressive power is usually tied to some form of violence or force. The police and the military are a force of repressive power, and they have a responsibility to their system to enforce its laws with violence. Indeed, it needs that violence, otherwise it surrenders its power. There are obvious questions about what causes people to commit crimes and what we consider a crime in the first place, but that's a much bigger discussion for another day. The important thing to note here is that those boundaries about what a crime is are set by normalizing power. Repressive power can actually be seen as a failure of normalizing power because it only steps in to do the work that it was never supposed to need to do in the first place. If you hadn't stolen that thing because the normalizing power of society had successfully instilled its values in you, then the repressive power of the police would no longer be necessary. You could say societies need long-term, uninterrupted structure to provide proper normalizing power and not, say, military intervention. Because without something that defines those boundaries and has the support to instill the right values, then the rules aren't followed. And then physical repression has to be ever present. That description might remind you of certain places today. There are other forms that repressive power takes too. A ticket inspector reminding you not to park there too long is a threat that if you do, he will intentionally harm you by giving you a ticket. In that example, the ticket would constitute economic violence. While it's true that normalizing power affects everyone, it doesn't mean that it necessarily affects everyone in the same way. White Americans during the Civil Rights era got the message from normalizing power that you are free, and to some of them, that was the end of it. But Black Americans experienced a layer on top of that, another message that was sent to them by the normalizing power of the time, which said, you are mostly free, but not entirely. When it comes to repressive power, Black people are also at a disadvantage there as well, because a threat of violence that is empty doesn't really hold anyone to account. This meant that when white people in the southern states lynched Black Americans, they knew that the threats of violence against them would not be enforced. On the other hand, Black people knew that the threats of violence against them were likely to be enforced, even if they'd never invited that threat by committing a crime. Now that we've talked about these two types of power, let's talk about the civil rights movement. And bear in mind the realities brought about by these two types of power that Black people had experienced during the civil rights movement. Part 3. The Civil Rights Movement, MLK, and Malcolm X. Politics is the process of redistributing power. It's usually depicted as a struggle between political parties, but it also exists elsewhere, and in fact very little of our politics actually occurs in the forum. Politics exists between groups of people, say in a workplace, a friendship circle, or in this case, between Black people and racists in the United States. Black people during the civil rights movement campaigned to redistribute power in their favor through stories of race, music, culture, and by political activism. This was an attempt to change the narrative that Black people experienced in the US. Before the civil rights movement began in 1954, Martin Luther King was an invisible academic for the most part. He didn't have a focus on nonviolent tactics until after he'd actually received numerous death threats. MLK realized that he couldn't solve the problem at hand with retaliatory violence. After all, Black people were a tiny minority in the world's most armed and wealthiest country. He gave his first speech about nonviolence after his house was bombed and delivered it to a group of angry Black armed protesters at the front of his house. Martin Luther King was a deeply religious man, and he got his ideas about nonviolence from his study of theology and from personalism, a branch of philosophy that teaches the infinite value of humanity. But he got his methods from the study of Mohandas Gandhi. MLK knew that most of his supporters actually didn't believe in nonviolence, but nonetheless he was still able to convince them of its efficacy. MLK himself saw it not only as the best strategy, but also as the only way of life. He believed the universe was moving towards justice and peace, and that no one could stop that realization. You could only be part of it. In the public eye, MLK led the civil rights movement from 1955 up to his assassination in 1968. And even then, when his methods were proving less effective and less popular, he was still dedicated to nonviolence. MLK focused almost all of his efforts in the southern states, and he was far less successful in the north. Many people believe the northern counterpart to MLK was Malcolm X, who is still perceived as one of the most vicious race critics of all time and believed heavily in violent action. While the overt racism prevalent in the southern states was very easily exposed in the media by MLK, Malcolm X was in the north and focused his efforts on white liberal supremacy, which is a far more insidious form of racism. The racist attitudes of the North were more deeply entrenched. They're more about who goes to which church or which school, or who has realistic access to certain job markets, which neighborhoods the police patrolled in, that kind of thing. When it came to the police in the North, it was more about who turned the other cheek and who looked the other way. Malcolm believed that the non-violence that MLK preached was a mistake. He thought that white people would never adopt such a strategy in their pursuit of power, and Black people shouldn't either. He believed that Black people should take back their power by force, and is famously quoted as saying that violence is the only thing the white man understands. Sadly, MLK actually became a convenient ally of white supremacists in the North. They used his teachings of non-violence to discourage Black people from violent protest, to maintain their racist system effectively. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King both changed the balance of power over the course of the civil rights movement and brought major social and legal reform. The main difference between how these two parties brought about that change is that the non-violent protesters did not exercise their repressive power through violence. Or did they? As we're about to see, there's been an ongoing discussion about nonviolence and just how nonviolent it actually is. Part 4. Nonviolence and its connection to violence. MLK wasn't an extremist. He wasn't stupid, and he really didn't act alone. He had a close circle of academic and strategic friends within the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization that he founded with Christian belief as well as nonviolence at its core. MLK very much believed in not being physically violent, but he was okay with self-defense, inciting violence, boycotting businesses, and using political pressure to cause a crisis. As Adam Roberts notes in his paper Martin Luther King and Nonviolent Resistance, the pattern of nonviolent action and legal action stimulating and reinforcing each other will continue to be important in the US. Nonviolence forced racists to confront their own violence and made it obvious to everyone else in the face of pacifism. Violence exhibited towards peaceful protesters angered onlookers and fed the media, and encouraged them to take the side of the protesters. In this way, nonviolent protest does actually cause violence, and actually encourages it. It's a quintessential part of the strategy of nonviolence. While violence between groups strengthens their resolve in their respective causes, nonviolence causes the oppressing side to alienate itself through its own actions. On top of this, nonviolent protest exists as a coercive pressure tactic which is aimed at legislators. As Adam Fairclough points out in his essay Martin Luther King Jr. and the Quest for Nonviolent Social Change, the daring freedom rides of May and August 1961 demonstrated that nonviolent protest could spur the government to action, even against its will, by creating a crisis of law and order to which it had to respond. It's hard not to notice that the success of MLK's nonviolence and its failure in the northern states correlates almost directly with the amount of violence that actually occurs. The question we put to MLK's nonviolence is not does it work? It is instead, do we consider the violent oppressors who use physical force to be instruments of violence utilized by the non-violent protesters? Additionally, do we consider the coerced legal outcomes of non-violent protest to be violent as well? Martin Luther King clearly thought that even if his movement encouraged violence, that was not a bad thing, saying instead, "When you give witness to an evil, you do not cause that evil, but you oppose it so it can be cured." While this viewpoint is generally innocuous and violence is not always bad, there are still lots of people who disagree that this is what non-violence actually is. In modern non-violent protest, a common tactic is still to goad law enforcement into displaying the violence that the protesters claim is inherent in their system. Is that goading in itself violent? It is, after all, designed to cause some level of harm to that party, or at least to their cause. Another question that this prompts is, does it matter if MLK's approach encouraged retaliatory violence and caused economic harm, if it was also equally efficacious and necessary to uphold the rights of Black Americans? Given the circumstances of numerous rights abuses at the time, this feels like the appropriate question to me, even though it does have a seemingly simple answer. A comparison of two different non-violent campaigns in the same paper by Adam Fairclough outline the differences in what MLK himself perceived to be his worst and his best campaign, in Birmingham and Albany respectively. When protests were planned for Albany, King was unprepared and faced off against Police Chief Laurie Pritchett. Pritchett knew exactly what King was trying to do and instructed his officers to make arrests courteously and without unnecessary force. He even went so far as to show them tapes about how to properly detain protesters. Pritchett also secured ample space in Albany's prison and the surrounding counties, so that he wouldn't run out of space with which to arrest protesters, and so that they were also separated when they were incarcerated. Because there was little violence, no pressure was created, and therefore certainly no crisis. So the city refused to negotiate, and the federal government was entirely absent. MLK learned from this experience very well, and just compare it to what happened the very next time in Birmingham. MLK deliberately chose Birmingham because it has a record of violent police brutality, and also because the chief of police there, Eugene Bull Connor, was a known white supremacist. As expected, Connor played right into King's hands. He arrested massive amounts of children, sprayed protesters with fire hoses, and even set dogs on them. Most importantly, the riots were reported on and televised all the way around the world. Fairclough notes in his paper that this wasn't the turning point for the civil rights movement in Birmingham, but it was spoken about in Congress. Because of the amount of notice that the protest generated, politicians were more likely to stand up and they were emboldened to speak about the equality that they already believed in. When the events at Selma took place, the discourse on race in Congress exploded. I won't go into Selma here, but it's considered to be the biggest march and turning point for the civil rights movement. The events of Albany clearly demonstrate that even the violence of arrest and the threat of jail were not enough to cause the non-violent protests to be effective in its own right. When non-violent protest was effective in Birmingham, excessive force was required for it to have the desired effect. As such, I think it's fair to say that even MLK's non-violent strategy requires some level of violence for it to be effective. Part 5. Modern Non-Violence and a Note on Violence. The problems with non-violence in terms of effectiveness only really arise when it's taken to the extremes. MLK's non-violence is, by today's standards, not extreme at all. Modern doctrines of non-violence often say that you cannot even sabotage a machine in order to stop it being used violently against nature, as that would be violence as well. You also cannot litigate in order to stop said violence, because that would just be a threat of violence being placed against that company. Even restraining a person who intends to harm someone is just inherently forceful and can be thought of as just more violence. One has to wonder what you can actually do. I found this really neat pamphlet by William Meyers called Nonviolence and Its Violent Consequences. He's an activist who's actually seen some of the watering down of nonviolence and direct action throughout his lifetime. The language that he uses clearly shows where his allegiance lies, but the main point of the article is bipartisan anyway. I'll link it below if you want to check it out. In this paper, William Meyers writes briefly about the Black Panthers being one of the most violent black rights groups at the time. The Black Panthers showed just how effectively force can actually be used, and very importantly, that violence does not always beget violence. People were willing to kill for racism, but almost no one could be found who was willing to die for racism. Once blacks started arming themselves and had the support at times of the National Guard, racists proved themselves to be cowards. They did not care about racism enough to die for it, but the Black Panthers were willing to die to end it. If the Black Panthers had listened to the non-violence police and the corporate media, we'd still have Jim Crow today, with its ongoing tide of violence. And the non-violence police would be patting themselves on the back, saying, "Racism is bad and violent, but at least we did not become like those violent folk." Part 6. How did all this change power for black people in the US? There's a belief common to all societies that violence is bad because it causes harm, and I think within certain parameters most people would agree with that. But as Martin Luther King showed, when violence or the incitement of it is necessary, it can become a useful tool to redistribute power. So how is repressive and normalizing power different now than it was then in the US? Well, it's a difficult thing to try and dissect. Doubtless there have been changes in power to the advantage of black people. Their welfare today is a lot better than it used to be. There was even a black president, and for 2 terms. That's quite an achievement on its own. But there are also areas in which very little has realistically changed. Even if equality has been assured legally, black people are often worse off than their white neighbours, socially and economically. Obviously, recent events have changed a lot about what certain people thought they knew about race and power in the US. But that's really part of the problem, is that black people have known this all along. In a sense, we're seeing an echo of the civil rights movement coming back right now. One can only hope that more meaningful change will come out of it. An important thing that this emphasizes is that listening to Black America and making it more visible is incredibly important. Revealing and discussing problems so that we're all aware of the situation is vital to actually being able to improve the situation. The power of Black America has definitely strengthened, and we all hope that the society that people in the US now get to grow up in is still moving in a positive direction, but it can never really move too fast. Both in its normalizing power, to make everyone want to treat black people the way that society says is required of white people as well, and in its repressive power, so that white people, especially white racists, are no longer delivered empty threats by the people that hold that power, and so that black people are treated with fairness and justice when they do break laws, instead of with prejudice. One last thought. Foucault's analysis of normalizing power, where the society that we live in generates our desires and our beliefs, generates, for me at least, an interesting question. Given that our society is vastly more white than it is black, and that we all contribute to bodies of normalizing power, Is white normativity racist and always to stay racist? Tell me what you think of that one in the comment section. I want to make it a regular thing at the end of every video to just leave you with a few links. Sometimes it'll be a piece of music, a poem, a book, and it'll just reflect a little bit about the subject we're talking about. The one I've chosen for this video might seem a little bit cliche, but for the people who actually don't know it, haven't been exposed to it, I think it's really important for this subject. So if you haven't heard it, you should check out Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday. I'll link it in the description. It was written in 1939 as a response to black lynchings in the southern states. Some people have actually called it the beginning of the civil rights movement. It's an incredibly important piece of history and a very beautiful song in its own way. But most importantly, it's a very sadly accurate expression of the collective experiences of black people in the US. So that's my first video. Thanks for sticking around. I hope you all enjoyed it and I didn't make too much of a mess of things. If you have any comments or criticisms, recommendations, leave them in the comments and I'll try and address them as soon as I can. I'm sure there will be people with very valid and cogent points, and any which I think are particularly important, I'll make sure to either amend if I've made a mistake or leave something in the description to let everyone know. Thanks very much.